Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and greetings from France. I am now living in France, and there'll be some updates coming to you on that front in very short order, as well as the opportunity to participate in some experiments I'm running on how to learn about philosophy and other subjects outside of college, which, as I mentioned in a previous lecture, is one of the most common questions that I receive. So stay tuned for several exciting updates and experiments. Today's lecture is sort of an addendum to the popular culture lecture on Huxley's Brave New World and Orwell's 1984. These two books are commonly referenced as experiments or thoughts on the nature of societies and dystopias. They're both obviously dystopias, and are used as a comparison to where we find ourselves in the modern world, and they're considered prescient, but they're both quite different and quite similar. And so I thought as a way of reflecting on the entire popular culture series and where we are today, these two works come up all the time, and so I thought a reflection on them, their contents, and how they actually relate to where we are might be enlightening. Might not be. Hopefully it is enlightening. So first, let's take the earlier of the two works is Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, which was written in 1932, I believe. I think he wrote it over a little time, so it was probably written slightly earlier than that, but it came out in 32. And it kind of grew out of his experience in post-World War I Europe and England, as he was looking around and seeing how the world had changed, essentially. And he was increasingly disillusioned with sort of the traditional upper class, middle class, pursuit of pleasure, acquiring material wealth, these sorts of traditional critiques. You see this in a work like Antiquae, which was published, I think, a little bit earlier around this same time. And it's not really a science fiction work. It's more of a meditation on his contemporary society. And it's funny. It's a funny, insightful, critique-rich book, but it's many of the similar themes come up. But the key elements in Brave New World are that everyone is brainwashed except for perhaps one guy, Mustafa Mund, who sort of runs the place. And they're sorted into different categories: alpha, beta, gamma. And all of our main characters, except for one, is an alpha or an alpha plus, which means that they're trained up, they're the elites. And this is very important as we move forward to recognize this. And that the betas and the gammas and the deltas, all these other people, they're just in the background, they're just going along. But that everyone is brainwashed even before they're born to want to live a certain way, and then they pursue that. And so the repressive structure in Brave New World is not so much a totalitarian centralized military government with surveillance and torture. Rather, it is sort of a popular, coherent society that's ruled by a single ideology, and everyone believes in it, and they go with it because, again, they've been brainwashed before they're born, and of course this continues, and they all think where they are is great and what's happening is great. And that eliminates a lot of suffering and pain and the confusion of a complex society that faces all these challenges. And so towards the end of the book, Mustafa Mund, who is one of the rulers of Brave New World, just articulates this. He says, look, no one is suffering, and this is the end goal. So, hey, if you're going to try and change this and make people suffer, this is bad, and so we're going to prevent you from doing that. And the characters who might have wanted to institute change, Bernard Marx and Helmholtz Watson and John the Savage, are basically sent away. They're not tortured, they aren't shot, they're just sent away. Like, hey, we got a place for you, we're sending you off so that you don't disturb the rest of society. And so what's crucial here is everyone is enjoying themselves. They have drugs to take. It's a very free love society. They have entertainment, they have food. There's no problem, right? There's no big suffering going on, quote unquote suffering per se. However, there's also no self-expression, no real sense of creativity or building or challenge. So the sort of that equation is built in Brave New World. Very different dynamic is present in 1984 where our main character, Winston Smith, is a member of the party that's ruling the places. He's the outer party, so he's sort of a small-time government bureaucrat, if you will. And Orwell wrote this post-war, 1949, having seen the totalitarian governments of Stalin and of the Nazi Germany, of course, of Hitler. And so he's responding to a very different sensibility and responding the way Huxley was responding to World War One. Orwell is responding to the horrors of World War II and what he sees as a terrifying aftermath. And he was terrified and afraid of this sort of highly centralized, repressive, torture-oriented, militaristic, totalitarian state or set of states that would dominate the world and dominate mankind. And so Winston Smith famously doesn't really rebel, he just tries to have a few thoughts. And, he sort of gets romantically involved with a woman, and that's enough to get him tortured by an inner party member, O'Brien, whether he's the single member or at least he's one of the inner party members. And so that's, again, a very different version of a dystopia. One, Brave New World, in which people are sort of sated with pleasure and brainwashing, and there isn't a lot of militaristic intervention and torture and brainwashing, and people aren't suffering. 1984, people really are suffering. Everything is run down and dirty. There's not enough food, but it is sustained by and driven by a centralized totalitarian state that tortures and surveils its citizens. A couple of interesting notes here. 1984 is very prescient in some sense. I would say not for our society. Similarly to Brave New World, not that helpful for our society. But if you look at something like Xi's China, I think this is often overlooked, that in 1984, there's three categories of people, very much in a way like Brave New World. In Brave New World, you have basically the betas, the deltas, the gammas. They're just a big mass of people who are doing whatever they're supposed to do, and everybody ignores them, and that's fine. And they're happy and well fed. In 1984, you have the proles, who just don't matter. They're just, and that's most people. They're just out there. No one cares about them. They step out of line, I guess they shoot them, but basically they really almost don't figure in the novel. Winston Smith is a party member. He's outer party against small bureaucracy. This is what the government focuses on. This is what their surveillance state is all about. It's about keeping the party pure, keeping them organized, keeping them on side. And then O'Brien is an inner party member, and he represents the real central power hierarchy. If you look at Xi's China, I think this is often overlooked. People say, China is a communist state or a communist party state. And what's important to note there is that the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, if you look at the membership, it's somewhere between 5 and 10% of the population, but some of this is simply functional membership. Like you need to be a member to do certain things that people want to do. Actual active, communist cadres is certainly not more than 5% of the population of China. And so, like 1984, you have this society where a very small percentage of the population hold all of the political power, and the rest of the population essentially are proles. Like they're there, they have to be managed, but they aren't participating in government. And a lot of the surveillance state that you hear about in China, of which there is a lot, has many elements that are similar to 1984, are focused on the party, on those 5% of the population that control vast majority of what's happening. But again, this means that 95% of the population are not members of the party. Traditionally, those 95% are free to do relatively what they want as long as they don't mess around with the government, right? Don't protest, don't try to do these things, but just go about your business. Now, this model is under a lot of strain now, potentially breaking down because of various economic problems. But a state like China today, where that spends as much or more on internal surveillance and security as they do on their military, which is a shocking amount of money, by the way, is very different from what you see in the United States. And they certainly aren't running on a model like Brave New World. So if the 1984 model is applicable anyway, it's much more in a country like China. And it's hard to find other ones besides like North Korea, but other of major countries, probably China is the only one that really comes close to something like a 1984 scenario. And so when most people talk about modern dystopias, it's Brave New World. They're like, yeah, we have some surveillance, we have the big AI companies, we have all these sorts of fears, but it's more the Brave New World. Like, oh, look, there's these masses of people who are just sated with, TV and movies and entertainment and drugs, and then that leaves a few elites to control everything and do whatever they want because the proles or the betas and the gammas are just out there brainwashed and doing what they're told, even though if you ask them, they say they're doing what they want. And so there's this notion that there's a big delta, a big difference between what people should want and how they should behave and how they would behave if they weren't in a system that brainwashed them and told them what to do, so on and so forth. And so Brave New World is the one that's held up as going, oh yeah, that's the world we live in, the world of Las Vegas, the world of all the distraction and pleasure that's sort of robbing of us of our capacity. However, I think this is also a very poor critique. And I think one way to think about this is if what 1984 and Brave New World, while being very different in many ways, they do share several similarities. One is they are both books that have a very elitist view on society. I mean, wow, very elitist. For all of Orwell's critique and for all of Huxley's critiques, in both novels, it is a very limited number of elites that matter, or that should matter, or that can matter. So both books really dismiss 90% of the population as being sort of irrelevant drones. Like Orwell wants them to be treated much better, wants them to have more freedom, doesn't want them to starve and live in poverty and nastiness, but it's not clear that they really matter. Similarly, in Huxley's, the alphas matter. They're the ones that make the decision. They're the one that makes the power. And it seems to have the suggestion that, yeah, this is the natural order of things. They aren't really critiquing this elitist cultural view. And both of them seem to be hearkening back to this notion that which was sort of vaguely true before World War I, that there was this sort of coherent cultural agreement pan-Europe that said, oh yeah, we know what's right. We kind of agree about what's going on in the world. We kind of understand what's right and wrong. We know that the world is going in a good direction. And that what World War I destroyed more than anything was this sense of a coherent, shared, pan-European sort of outlook on what constituted good culture, what was a good education, what made a gentleman, how economies should run. These sorts of questions were, quote unquote, pretty much answered when we agreed about them, and quality people knew what was good. Of course, they argued about this endlessly, but they agreed that they were going to argue about it, and that was enough. World War I completely blows this up, right? When you have this fervent nationalism, the totalitarianism, now the elites are in this world where, pure power, like naked power and state control, has replaced the sort of much softer sense of, a cultural coherence and agreement. And while they're both Huxley and Orwell are very critical of the concentrated totalitarian state, they do seem to both have this very strong sense of, a few great writers, a few artistic geniuses, a few political leaders in a democratic country should still control things, right? The good people should still be in charge. They just shouldn't torture and restrict the other people, right? So it's not an anti-elitist view of the world. It is a very organized, centralized view. It's just that the centralization has gone wrong. I think the sort of greatest articulator of this, although for some reason history has not recorded this very clearly, is Wilson, like Woodrow Wilson, the American president who was famous at the end of World War I for his, 14 points and all of this. Wilson was an absolutely rabid racist. I mean, oh my God, was he a racist? And he thought and believed in American exceptionalism to a phenomenal degree. But his idea was, look, America is the country that matters. We've been given a God-given destiny to conquer the world, and so we're going to do this. And Europeans, they don't know what they're doing. And what we need to do is partner with and help the Europeans out, because they're going to help us with the races, the dark races, the backward races of China and Africa and India. And we have just a God-given duty to run the world so that we can help those races, get educated and mature, the actual language that he used and his people used, to build a new, better world. But it was all going to center on the United States, and it was all going to be run by us, and it was all going to be our culture that dominated the world. Europe would help us out in doing this, but we weren't going to be pushed around by them anymore because we're the new power on the block, and their old systems don't work. And so that worldview that, hey, there is a system that a few educated elites are going to be able to put in place to make the world run is just pervasive. Like, it doesn't seem like anybody could really think outside of that box, even Huxley at the time. So if you read Huxley, if you read Brave New World, what you'll see towards the end is Mustafa Mund actually articulates this, like, hey, just leave everybody alone, leave the masses alone. If a few people want to do great things, well, we're just going to put them away and keep them safe from the regular people, right? It's the great people who create all the problems. It's the geniuses and the strivers and the people who want to build things. They're the problem. So we're just going to put them in little islands someplace where they don't hurt anybody. And the conceptualization here, of course, what it articulates to this view is like, yeah, there are very few people that really matter, that really create, that really do things, and everybody else just is a, beta, gamma, delta drone out there, and just leave them alone. Similarly, in Orwell's, O'Brien, inner party is like, look, the inner party is going to run this, Winston. Like, the regular people just don't matter. The proles don't matter. We're not. It's not about the proles. It's not about anybody else. It's about party purity of the few people, and that the inner circle is going to run things. And there is not a real sense of a revolutionary resistance to this. Again, the brainwashing is also present, which is why the newspeak and doublespeak is so important in 1984, because this is what keeps the proles confused and keeps them from reacting in any way. But there is no real sense that the proles matter or are important beyond just the notion that their lives shouldn't be so awful. That's kind of it. It'd be nice if the proles had a nicer life, not that the proles should be in charge of anything, if that makes sense. And so, again, for all of their powerful critique, in some ways, this very powerful, strong elitist view just sustains itself in both books, which I find interesting because it sort of sets a pattern. And as I talked about in the popular culture series, and again, just to repeat, and this is why I think understanding Woodrow Wilson as not an outlier of his time, but as like this great articulator of this, of the notion that, oh, there's going to be one world system. Is it going to be communism? Is it going to be fascism? Is it going to be whatever? And it's going to be driven by a few people or one country or a few countries, and everybody else is going to follow along. What I think is interesting, and what sort of defies all of the predictions of any dystopia that I'm familiar with, is that the world we find ourselves in, for all its troubles and problems, certainly is not a dystopia of either of those sorts in the Western world. Although, again, if you're in China, you're getting, 1984 is looking pretty prescient. But for most of the world, and certainly for the Western world, it's a very different scenario. It's an articulation of ideas and concepts where actually, and this is what I tried to articulate in the popular culture series, now the betas, the gammas, the deltas do matter. Everybody kind of sort of matters, and certainly they matter in aggregate, because they have this unbelievable capacity to choose. They have this ability to make decisions for themselves. And because there's a lot of people, even if they make a bunch of $5 decisions and there's 100 million of them, all of a sudden that's a $500 million decision cumulatively. And so one is a lot of the energy, a lot of the effort, a lot of the focus is put on trying to organize, trying to affect, trying to influence the proles and the betas and the gammas and the deltas, rather than simply ignore them, which is basically the model that you get in both 1984 and in Brave New World. It really seems hard for the authors to imagine that there's any scenario in which those people would really matter that much. Which is odd, particularly from Orwell, who when he has books like Roads to Wigan Pier and things where he really does critique sort of the lives and problems of working class coal mining families. I mean, he's very serious about that and really feels for them, but he doesn't have a sense that they're going to matter, just that they shouldn't have such sort of bad lives. And so it's interesting to be in a world that we live in where it's like, oh, look, like, no, the decisions of the masses actually have these huge impacts. One of the impacts that they have, which people bemoan endlessly, is because there's lots of people, the fragmentation of society makes it drowns out or challenges or undermines any sense that there is a dominant, centralized, coherent cultural agreement about what's good, what's great, what's important, what makes high art, what makes political rightness. All of the assumption that at some point we're going to have a society with an agreed meaning, with an agreed scenario narrative, and that narrative will include what's valuable, good, right, and true, is necessarily, as I keep pointing out, undermined when you give hundreds of millions, billions of people the opportunity to kind of do, think, and say and live within bounds however they want. And so you get this massive fragmentation, which is exactly what you would expect, because why would we expect everybody to agree and want to do the same thing? But we really resist this. We struggle with this culturally because we have this sort of imagined heritage that there was some time, which, is more imagined than real. But when we pretended like we had a shared culture, outlook, and ideal. So you can think about this. One example that I was thinking of and other points just relative to this is right now there's a big battle going on in Europe and the United States culturally, because lots of young people and increasing numbers of young people aren't even bothering to get driver's licenses. So if you live in societies that are dominated by cars and car culture and, car transportation and everything is car centric, cities like Houston and basically countries like the United States, and you start getting an increasing percentage of the population that just says, look, don't have a car, I can't buy a car because I don't have a driver's license. Well, this creates all kinds of problems because those people are going to need public transportation if they're going to operate in your society in any normal fashion. But car-dominated societies tend to resist quite aggressively public transportation. The United States sort of being the all-time great example of this. But, it's a battle that's going on all over Europe as well. Like, to what extent do you eliminate roads? To what extent do you increase train, bus service? How should those services be delivered? Do you take out parking and put in parks? Like, how much walkability should you, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It goes on and on. But it is a fragmentation. And so at the same time, you can have a country that's now just saying, oh, we've got some people who are going, no, we're not even going to get a driver's license, right? We're done with cars. And other people going, no, we need to invest in, more freeways, more cars, more better. This sort of fundamental shift. And this happens in a culture, particularly in the United States again, where the car was this iconic symbol of freedom, and this is going to be a new moment in your life, and now that you can drive, you have the opportunity, you can go where you want. There's a generation coming up that many of them just do not believe this. They no longer buy into this narrative. and it creates tension. All over the United States and Europe, you have populist politicians who are trying to appeal to a lost, moment of cultural coherence. Now, how historically accurate these appeals are, pretty dubious, but nonetheless, this is the appeal. And the appeal works because people really do want that. Populism works when it appeals to people's sense that, no, I want to live in a coherent social narrative so that everybody knows what's right and wrong. In a way, people do want to live in Brave New World. Not so much 1984, but Brave New World-ish looks kind of good. I have some food, I have a nice place to live, and I know what's right and wrong, and everybody agrees with me, and that makes my life good. This is essentially the populist argument. And so this appeal to a imagined lost past when this was the state of being is powerful and resonates, not because it ever existed, although to a certain extent the narrative did, but because we live in a time when we feel that massive fragmentation. But again, that massive fragmentation is an outcome of what neither Orwell or Huxley really seemed to imagine, that not that power was going to be centralized and made coherent and totalitarian, again, as it is in China, Xi's China, but rather than what you're seeing in much of the rest of the world, which is that there's many, many power centers. There's multiple places where, and competing, and this fragmentation. So the classic example in the United States right now is the governor of Florida, for some bizarre reason, has decided to attack Disney. So Disney, as I mentioned, is this, very powerful, super influential corporate entity. Well, this governor of Florida, also a powerful, political governor of Florida, is a powerful position with lots of authority. And so they've decided to go to war. And it's ugly, and it doesn't look like it's going to turn out well for any of the parties, but probably certainly not DeSantis, who is the governor of Florida. And so that's what seems to be more of the moment. You have political power fighting with corporate power. You have corporate power fighting with, NGOs, non-government organizations that are trying to put in environmental policies. You have local government fighting with state governments fighting with national governments. You have, all the different disagreements and arguments between states. If you look at Europe, you have the European Union political structure that is fighting with the state level political structures. Hello, Brexit, right? Where England decided for some insane reason to throw themselves off a cliff, which seems not like a very good idea. But again, that was a populist appeal. Let's go it alone. Let's go back to this England that was coherent, and we weren't involved with all this fragmentation and having to listen to what these bureaucrats over there had to say about England, and making rules for us to live by. Again, sort of suicidal, but nonetheless, this was the appeal. But it's that appeal of coherence in a world that is not totalitarian and centralized, but is in fact decentralized and multipolar and multivalent, and most importantly, massively fragmented. And so this goes back a couple of years ago, but one of the most popular, most influential TV shows of recent times was Game of Thrones, which I did not watch. I tried to watch a little bit of it. It seemed to be a touch violent for me, so I stopped watching. But lots of people were talking about it. It was in the newspapers, and so I was teaching my class popular culture, on which the popular culture lecture was based. And I asked how many people in the class had been watching this series. And it was, I think, season 3 or 4, so right at peak popularity. And everybody, raised their hand, and it was about 20% of the class. I think of the 28 students, I think about 6 of them had been watching it, and 1 or 2 had said, "Oh, I tried to watch a little bit, but I didn't get into it, so I didn't watch it." And the other ones, some of the people had heard about it and just not watched it, and some have not heard about it at all. And so it's like, wow, here is what is without doubt at the time the most popular sort of streaming TV thing that had happened in a long time. And only about 20% of the target age group had really even bothered to watch or cared about it in any way, which is to say 80% didn't. And what's interesting to me about this is you have not a dominant culture overriding culture, although there are more abstract historical and sociological forces at work. But if you look at any particular cultural production, be it some big World Cup soccer match, or big novel that's published, or super popular movie, regardless, you pick whatever it is, most people are neither going to have heard of it nor care about it. Like, this is the place we're at. Now, this was always true historically. This has always been the case. But before, there was this elite, say 5 or 10%. And so what they cared about and what they thought about ended up influencing everybody else. And people thought that it must be important, even if they haven't read the novel or listened to the music or paid attention to the political movement or whatever. It seemed like it mattered because all the people who quote unquote mattered were participating in it. But as any sense of a coherent cultural elite has vanished and dissolved, what you end up with is no one knows what really matters, what's really important, because some people care a lot about the Game of Thrones series. Some people care a lot about the World Cup matches. Some people care about whatever it is they care about, but no one really seems to care about all that much in particular. And so it's a strange place. And neither Brave New World nor 1984 addressed this, because they were worried about sort of the opposite, which was the hyper-centralization, hyper-control. And what's interesting to me is this is, and hopefully to you as well, is this is the same mistake or one of the mistakes that Marx makes, is he absolutely was a great critiquer of capital and of the social effects of capitalism as it was developed, and particularly industrial capitalism. But he kept misunderstanding the direction, completely misunderstood what was happening as far as what was going to go on. He figured that there would be less and less middle-class people, and you would either move up and become, the small ruling capitalist elite, or you'd move down and become the proletarian working masses. Again, 1984, Brave New World, right? Like the most people just don't matter, and that what would happen is eventually there would be so many people who were proletarian unhappy that they would just overthrow. This is a very sketchy critique. But the weird thing that happened, and that nobody seemed to have predicted, is that the petite bourgeoisie just simply kept expanding and expanding and expanding and expanding and expanding until you get to a place where they became the most powerful, important, driving cultural force, which horrified everybody. Nobody was in favor of this. Like, oh, we don't want all those, betas and deltas, deciding culture, making decisions, influencing how the world goes. So no one really predicted this or felt this. And yet this is the world that we live in. To the extent that, I don't think it's certainly not a dystopia in the sense of Brave New World or 1984, but it makes it hard to track our problems, again, unless you live in Xi's China, in which 1984 is for you. But it makes it hard for us to track these sorts of arguments from the past onto today's world, because it seems like prior to maybe, say, like 1950s or 60s, it was really hard for people to think that, wow, we might live in a society where all of these patterns just emerge from. They aren't planned, they aren't dominated, they aren't controlled. They emerge from sort of the liberation and empowerment of hundreds of millions, nay, billions of people. And that when you actually do give them a fair amount of resources and a fair amount of choice, wow, what do you get? You get crazy shit. You get fragmentation. You get disorientation. You get an unbelievable level of complexity. And all of which is not to say that, governments aren't trying to control people, and marketers are trying to control people, and all of this is going on. Lobbyists are trying to influence all of this. That's all true. But this is all happening against a backdrop of just unbelievable fragmentation and decentralization. Despite the fact that everybody keeps talking about centralization and so many billionaires and so few people have so much money. Yes, true. Like, look at the numbers. There's no arguing about that. However, underneath that, what you have is the proles, the betas, the gammas, the deltas have just massively more money, opportunity, and time, and than they ever had, than anybody ever predicted they would. It's just phenomenal. And so it is this sort of fragmentation and the interface of all these different power centers that seem to be driving us mad, that tend to be driving people to look for models of dystopia in things like 1984 and Brave New World. But I'm not sure they actually map that well onto many aspects of our current society. So for those two books, I think they're worth a read. I mean, they're both great books, particularly 1984. Brave New World is a little more clearly polemical, I would say. 1984 just is a hugely powerful and moving work. But neither, I think, really tracks that well into the sort of world of the dynamics and problems and cultural and political problems that we face when you're looking at societies that are dominated by decentralization, by fragmentation, rather than sort of totalitarian centralization. And so it's a whole different set of things to think about. And so when we think dystopia and we think about the world we find ourselves in, I think it's better or more valuable to think, again, what are the problems of this emergent properties of distributed power centers and millions and hundreds of millions of free, in quote, actors, rather than of centralized state elites controlling the activities of everyone and resisted by, the noble few. So 1984, Orwell, and the current state of society. Thank you very much.